CCG Global Dialogue Series featuring Professor Kishore Mahbubani, author of Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. This program is jointly presented to you by the Center for China and Globalization and the China CITIC Press. This session is presided by CCG President, Dr. Wang Huiyao. Dr. Wang, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning to our audience in China, but also good evening to Professor Kishore Mahbubani in New York, and also, of course, our friends tuning in here or elsewhere worldwide. So this is really a special dialogue series, global dialogue series conducted by CCG at CCG head office. So we are really pleased to and also host today Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is also a good friend of mine, old friend of mine, and to talk about his latest new book, actually just translated into English and Chinese, actually, published in China by CCG, Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. So this is really a fascinating book and has been really had a wide attention already in China. So we're actually going to talk about this book, but also this book on other issues as well. But allow me quickly to introduce my guest today. Professor Mahbubani is a man of many accomplishments. He's a distinguished fellow at Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Of course, he's also the founding dean of the Li Guangyao School of Public Policy at that university. I remember many years ago, we had many times, I went to that school and had meetings with Professor Mahbubani. But also, he's also a renowned, very successful diplomat and also intellectual in public policy and international relations. Professor Mahbubani served as a Singapore ambassador to the United Nations, but also he actually also served one time as a UN National Security Council chair. So he's very well spent 10 years in the UN on behalf of Singapore, and also he actually has a very significant recognition. For example, in 2019, he was elected as an honorary international member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's also the author of many books. I remember I attended the last your book hosted at Peking University about the Asian about Asian ASEAN, actually the book about ASEAN Way that was really well received as well. So I'm very glad to have Kishore with me today, and also thank you, Kishore. I haven't seen you for some time. Since last time we were actually at the Monk debate in Toronto, where we are as a team to face in also General H.R. McMaster and also Michael Pillsbury from US. So we actually managed to win that debate. Really nice to see you again. So the first, maybe you want to say hello to the Chinese audience and also audience watching us from other parts of the world. And then we will get into a dialogue. So why don't you say hi and
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful dialogue. Yes, I remember very well the debate that you and I had with General McMaster and Michael Pillsbury, who, of course, both of whom are better known than you and me. And everyone thought that General McMaster and Michael Pillsbury would, of course, win the debate, the Monk debate. And surprisingly, you and I won the debate, which is a very good development. But it also reflects the fact that if you try to use reason and logic and use scientific evidence to back up your arguments, you can win a debate. And at a time now, when the US-China geopolitical contest, sadly, is going to gain momentum, and it's going to gain momentum for the reasons that I document in my book, Has China Won?, which you have kindly arranged for the translation into Chinese. And I thank you very much for that. But it's important for us to do the best we can to avoid the worst case outcome emerging in the US-China geopolitical contest. Certainly, I think all of us have a moral obligation to prevent a war happening between US and China. And if in the course of this dialogue today, Henry, you and I can help to promote better understanding between US and China and between East and West, then I think we are fulfilling a very important moral mission in the very challenging world that we live in today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kishore, for your encouraging words. As a matter of fact, that's exactly the reason we've been hold on this dialogue until your book is coming out, because this CCG special series dialogue we already conducted with Graham Allison, Thomas Friedman, Joseph Nye, Martin Wolf, and also Pascal Lamy, and many, Angus Deaton, and a number of well-known global opinion leaders. And they actually, as you said, they agree with you. We need the China-US relation has to be handled with special care, and also there should be no the Cold War decoupling. Actually, that was a consensus. Actually, they've been telling me. So I'm very pleased to have you to really raising this awareness, so that, as you said, we can really trying to have a more responsibility to raise the understanding between East and West, and you are playing particularly well that role. I mean, being an observer, many years in Singapore and internationally. Being a bridge between East and West, you've been really doing a great. So has China One actually has been translated by CCG to Chinese and is published by CITIC Press Group, which is a very well-established publishing company in China. I wrote a forward for this Chinese version. So it is amazing, actually, that this book has offered a comprehensive and sober analysis of the Sino-American relation. It also provides suggestions to both countries from you, someone who knows both East and West so well, and also with a third-party view on that perspective. So can you tell me? I'm curious. You've been the dean for many years. I know you've been busy, and also you've been well sorted after for all kinds of international events. So can you tell us a bit about what sparked your interest in writing this book, and what do you think about the China-US relations when you're writing this book?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question, Henry. And I think the reason why I wrote the book is that, if you can imagine two trains coming down the same track and gaining momentum and heading towards a collision, what do? Do you say, carry on, have a collision? Or do you say, stop? Think twice. Do you really want this kind of direct collision? So right now, unfortunately, the United States has launched a geopolitical contest against China. And so as a result of that, the US and China are racing towards a collision like two trains. And my goal is to try and stop the worst case scenario of an all-out collision between these two trains. And the reason why this is happening, why is that this collision happening? And actually, this is what I try to analyze in my book. It's happening for structural reasons. It's not due to personalities. Everyone thought, hey, the US-China contest started because of Donald Trump. But you notice, in the first paragraph of my book, I say, the US-China contest was launched by Donald Trump, but it will outlast him. Doesn't matter who's the president. And sure enough, after Joe Biden became president of the United States of America, he couldn't change anything. The contest still continues. And even though Joe Biden said in his election campaign that Trump's tariffs are hurting the American people, hurting the American workers, Joe Biden cannot remove them. And why can't you remove them? Because the geopolitical contest is driven by structural forces. And that is actually the main reason why I wrote this book, to try and explain the structural forces that are driving this contest. And let me quickly just mention three. One is, of course, the fact that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which is United States, the world's #1 power will always push down the world's #1 emerging power. So when the United States tries to prevent China from succeeding, that's normal behavior. That's what all great powers do. But the second structural force, which is something that nobody talks about, which is that there is also a fear of the yellow peril in the Western imagination. Now, this is something that is politically incorrect to discuss in many Western circles, but it's a fact. It's been there in Western history. And at the end of the 19th century, the United States Congress passed something called the United States Racial Exclusion Act to keep out Chinese migrants. Now that already confirms that there is this fear of yellow peril that exists in the American psyche as well as the Western psyche. And of course, there's also the third structural force that's also explaining this downturn in US-China relations, is that there's been a bipartisan consensus in the United States among both the Republicans and the Democrats, that after the United States engaged China, after the United States opened up China economically, China would also open up politically and become a liberal democracy, and then the liberal democracy of China and the liberal democracy of United States would live happily ever after. Now, as we know, that's a fairy tale, but that's what Americans believed in. And because they believe in it, they're very disappointed that China is not creating a political system that the Americans like. And so the net result of it is that this is another reason why the US-China geopolitical contest is gaining momentum. So there are structural reasons why this is happening, and it's not due to personalities. And therefore, that's what I hope my book will help to contribute, make a contribution towards, is an understanding of why this is happening, this US-China geopolitical contest.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kishore. Yeah, actually, I think that's a great rationale for writing this book, is really to fundamentally identify the structural problem that is really coming into being now. And I think President Trump just probably made it happen, but there was something built up already for some time. And but as you said, you know, there are those structural problems which Graham Allison called it the Husserl's trap, and also the fear of yellow peril, as you mentioned, but also the bipartisan consensus of the whole across the board in the United States. That is something really, really frightening too. So you're right. I think Chinese people actually, you know, historically has always been a peace-loving, never colonized any other places. I mean, you mentioned in your book that Zheng He, a journal in the Ming Dynasty, actually has voyaged as far as to Africa. You know, they never stayed there, never occupied any colony. That was 100 years before Columbus discovered America. So you're right. I think, you know, recently we've been seeing some you know, positive movement because after, you know, the president started a trade war in 2018. Now it's about 4 years, almost 4 years, 3-4 years later now, and we see that you know, it cannot carry on. We see a supply chain crisis going on, where China is still the magnetic for the global trade. I mean, its export with US has reached a historical high, and the total China foreign trade has actually also at historical high. I mean, even during the pandemic year, and but also now we see US has released Madame Meng of Huawei, and and also they are receiving 100 to 200,000 students back to the United States to study again. So those things signals that, yeah, maybe we still have to work together. Like Catherine Chai said recently, we need to recouple. You know, Secretary of Commerce also said, you know, that China will have to do business with China. So I think, do you see a scenario that, of course, this kind of a drastic bashing China, drastic sanction China, doesn't really work? I mean, we really live in the 21st century. We have to probably have somehow continue the economic activities, you know, trade and people-to-people exchange. So we hope, can we manage this risk? As I was talking to Martin Wolf, he said we need to really manage our geopolitical risk. Like some journal, U.S. journal in the U.S. administration, where during the Trump era at the end, they were trying to avoid the hot war. And so can we really manage this risk? But of course, we're going to have a structural problem 5-10 years time. Even Joseph Nye said maybe by 2035, we'll see a little bit of normalizing. So what do you think of the horizon? How long are we going to have this kind of a fight? And can we manage it at a minimum, you know, at a manageable level, so that we don't get into a hot war? I mean, you know, or over issue of Taiwan or anything like that, or South China Sea.
Well, I mean, those are very good questions you're asking, Henry, and you're right. I mean, as I have a whole chapter in my book devoted to the question, is China expansionist? And of course, I cite the example of Emerald Cheng He, who traveled all the way from China to Africa, and he could have conquered many territories, many countries, but he never did so. And so the whole idea that the West has that China is expansionist is not true. If China was expansionist, Australia will be a Chinese colony and not a British colony, because Australia is much closer to China than it is to Great Britain, from which it was colonized. But at the same time, you're also right. I'm glad you mentioned Martin Wolf. I'm glad you mentioned Joseph Nye. And you spoke about how they mentioned that we got to find a ways and means of managing this U.S.-China geopolitical contest. And I agree with them. There is absolutely no reason, and that is the conclusion of my book, as you know, at the end. I say the paradox about the U.S.-China geopolitical contest is that it's inevitable and avoidable, right? You can avoid it because at the end of the day, if the goal of the United States is to improve the well-being of its people, if the goal of China is to improve the well-being of its people, they should be working together rather than working against each other. And that's why I wrote my book. And so I agree with your arguments. But at the same time, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that I've been in New York. Yeah. And I've been in the United States now for 8 days. And the mood in the United States is very anti-China. Very. And I have met many Americans who say to me directly, openly, honestly, China is the enemy. And I was quite shocked, because even though I have written a book about US-China relations, so I know the state of US-China relations. But even in the time since I've written my book, right, and since I researched my book, there has been a tremendous shift against China in the American body politic. And that's a very sad thing, by the way. And I actually believe that there is no reason why the United States should regard China as the enemy. Because China is not trying to conquer the United States of America. China is not sending naval vessels to go to California. China is not sending armies to the Mexican border, to the Canadian border to invade the United States. It's not happening. And yet, so many people in the United States believe that China is the enemy. And so, so even though all the people that you have interviewed, the Joe Nyes, the Martin Wolves, and others, Tom Friedmans, who at the end of the day, I think I know them all, want to try and achieve a reasonable outcome. But at the end of the day, it's the politicians who have to make the decision. And you notice, as I said, that even though the Joe Biden himself said that Trump's tariffs and sanctions have hurt the American people, he cannot remove them. He cannot do anything about them. And even Catherine Tai, whom you mentioned, I was hoping that in her speech she would say, okay, we will lift some of the tariffs and sanctions because they haven't helped the American people. But she can't do it. You see? So the mood in the United States, Henry, today is so anti-China that I'm personally very frightened by it. Really frightened by it. I had no idea how much the mood against China has become so negative in the United States. And that's why we need to have this dialogue to prevent the worst case outcome happening between US and China.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, we haven't been to the US since the COVID broke out, January, February last year. I mean, so it has been really. And also, there's no foreigner comes to China too because of COVID. Because we, any foreigner come to China, there will be 3 to 4 weeks quarantine. That is a huge time investment to come. So it's really made that difficult. But this communication, I mean, are we in a communication crisis? For example, we recently published another book called Consensus or Conflict. Which we have gathered so many authors to contribute on that book, published by Springer Nature, and you kindly contribute that chapter there too. That has been downloaded for 100,000 times already. It's amazing. But one of the chapters we're talking about is, are we in the communication crisis? Because you see in China, we don't. I mean, English is not our native language. We don't have an international. Anglo-Saxon, they have a big impact, build up the international, media and all those, mainstream outlets of all the Western voice, and then they are not able to come to see what really in China happening. And of course, also the narrative of China, because we're not really good at the international language. So we really need to, how we can really enhance that. I think you mentioned some of that in your book as well, that, this communication and then this dialogue. And of course, the final question of your book is not whether America has won or China has won, is really the humanity has to win. And I mean, we're facing pandemic, which is like a third of a world virus war. It's not a world war, but a virus war. And we're not really getting our act together. And that is really something, really afraid of. But then you said everybody has already, in the US, come to this kind of a consensus. I mean, view China as an evil empire. That's something really, how we can correct that. I mean, of course, the dialogue is, you are doing it. Your book you've been writing is so important to do that.
Well, I think you're right. The danger is that many Americans have already begun to see China as the evil empire, and we must, in one way or another, challenge that perception. But that requires a lot of effort, Henry, a lot of effort. And here, actually, I believe that the rest of Asia must speak out more loudly and more strongly to say that the US-China geopolitical contest is not just damaging the United States, not just damaging China, it's also damaging the rest of the world. And certainly, I'm very glad you mentioned that we face common global challenges. We have the global challenge of COVID-19, which is still not over. And you're right. I mean, I haven't been to the US for 18 months because of COVID-19. Normally, I come 2-3 times a year to the United States. And I also go to China 2-3 times, and I cannot visit China still. And I cannot even go to China to launch my book, this book that you just showed, because of the quarantine requirements that China has. So COVID-19 is a common challenge. And equally, climate change is a common challenge that we all have to work together for. And you mentioned the last part of my book where I say it's not a question of whether or not China has won or whether US has won, but it's a question of whether humanity has won. And in the same last page, I say that, you know, we in humanity think that we are much smarter than the apes, you know, in living in the forest. But if the apes are living in a forest, if the forests around them are burning, the stupidest thing they could do is continue fighting. They should come together to put out the fire in the forest. And the global warming is basically asking humanity, are you really the most intelligent species on planet Earth? If global warming is going to kill human beings, regardless of whether you are in China or United States or Bangladesh or Brazil or Nigeria or Norway, it doesn't matter. Climate change is a common challenge. So all of humanity, we should be coming together to fight climate change, and therefore we should press the pause button on this US-China geopolitical contest. I'm very glad that you mentioned the other book that, as you know, I contributed an essay to, and I'm glad it's been downloaded 100,000 times. But I think it needs to be downloaded 1 million times or 10 million times if you're going to reach the 7 billion people in the world today, 7.8 billion people in the world. So I think it's important for us, Henry, for reasonable people like you and me to continue to speak out as loudly and clearly to say, hey, all of humanity today have common concerns and common dangers. And the need to cooperate is much more important than the differences that we have. But giving that kind of message in today's environment, even especially in the United States, is going to be very, very difficult. But we must keep trying, Henry. And that's why I congratulate you for having all these dialogues with people like Tom Friedman, Joseph Nye, Angus Deaton, you know, Pascal Lamy. It's very important you continue doing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, Kishore, I'm really pleased to hear that. You encourage our activities. So since the China-US being one of the, I think, two most important bilateral relations, and then we can't really let that go extremely wrong or go to the really more dangerous stage. I think maybe there's a few areas we could talk about further that we could collaborate. So see, we can really get both countries can be held together and at least at a manageable level. I mean, first, as you mentioned already, this climate change. I mean, we just had this COP 15 in Kunming, which is a biodiversity, and also President Xi actually announced 1.5 billion RMB, which is over 240 million US dollars in terms of setting up a biodiversity protection fund for developing countries. So that is really, China is actually doing something every time, when those international events come up. But also we are having COP 26 coming up as well in Glasgow. So how do you think this incoming COP 26 that can really make the world work together? I mean, U.S. Of course is very active on the COP 26, but U.S. hasn't really joined the biodiversity Convention of Biodiversity (CBD), on that yet. But But I know that the climate change is really a huge problem. We have hot fires in the U.S., floods in Europe, in China, and volcanoes, and I mean extreme weathers these days. For example, we had the most rainfall we had for Beijing this year, and then now it's getting extreme, very cold now. So how do we can work together to solve this? This first, one of the common challenge. I mean, in addition to the pandemic, this climate change that really facing not only China but the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And by the way, I'm very happy to hear that President Xi has decided to contribute 1.5 billion renminbi towards the biodiversity challenge. And here I must say that the tragedy about China is that quite often on global challenges, China is making a lot of contributions, but China is not very good at marketing its contributions. The world doesn't know what China is doing. And I'll give you 3 or 4 concrete examples, Henry, to prove my point. Firstly, China is the first country in the world to speak about the concept of ecological civilization, which means that as you modernize and develop, you must take care of your environment also, right? Now, nobody has heard of ecological civilization. And this is a tragedy. Here is China committing itself to be the first civilization, committing itself to developing an ecological civilization, and nobody knows about it. Secondly, if you look in terms of why climate change is happening now, it's not just happening because of the new flows of greenhouse gas emissions from China, India, and the rest of Asia. It's also happening because of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions that the Western industrialized countries have put in there since the Western Industrial Revolution over 100, 200 years ago. So again, that's something that most people in the world are not aware of, right? Nobody knows about it. In fact, I wrote an article called Climate Justice, and I published it in the Singapore Straits Times. And I'm happy to send you a copy for you to share with your readers, pointing that out. And then thirdly, China has done so much in terms of reforestation, right? I mean, it's reforested an area the size of Belgium or bigger in China. And again, nobody knows about it. No one knows about it. And then you make the other contributions you made, for example, I understand that when President Xi Jinping decided that there'd be no more shark's fin served in meals produced by the Chinese Communist Party, the price of shark's fin dropped and lots of sharks were saved in the world, right? And again, all these things that China has done in a concrete fashion, no one knows about. Nobody knows these facts, which is actually quite shocking and quite stunning. So this is why it's very important for China to make a bigger effort to try and explain to the rest of the world what it is doing. And I think it's important to make sure that this message is conveyed not necessarily by spokesmen of China, but by friends of China around the world. I mean, and all they shouldn't what's the word for it? They shouldn't deploy Chinese propaganda. They should just tell the facts. That's the scientific facts of what China has contributed. And certainly, I give you another big example, right? If China had decided that it would produce the same number of gasoline cars as United States, that would have been terrible for climate change. But China is now the leader in producing electric cars. And electric cars will help to save the global environment. And China is a leading supplier of solar power or of wind turbines energy. Again, the world doesn't know all these facts. So I think it's important for China to look for friends who can explain. Again, I said, it's not propaganda.
Yes.
Just state the facts. Just give the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. And that's something that China has not been very good at doing so far. And that's why there's so much negative coverage of China in the Anglo-Saxon media.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think that's exactly, you give some concrete answers to this communication crisis, or maybe or dilemma that China is facing. On the one hand, China is really doing very well on the KPI, as you talk about climate change. The greener that China contributed in the last 20 years actually accounts about 20 to 25% of the global green is actually, as you said, as large as Argentina. And yet not many people know that. And we really need to, have a better narrative for that. But also, as you said, let other people talk about rather just one channel. So exactly. And, one thing I felt as well, that China has always been doing great things, like President Xi mentioned about before 2030, China trying to reach a carbon peak, and before 2060, China reach carbon neutral. It's too before, not too by. So that means could be ahead of schedule a bit as well. And the other thing is President Xi also announced this year at the UN that they're going to stop the building fossil power plants outside China, which is, immediately another big commitment. Actually, in China, the 14th five-year plan already, made a target that by the 5 years' time, they conclude they'll cut the energy per GDP consumption down 18%. They'll cut the carbon down by 13%. So it's a really a lot of concrete plan, yet not properly explained. So I have a another question is that China's been doing well on those KPI. Like now we are in a supply chain crisis world now. I mean, President Biden just announced a few days ago they're going to have the port in New York or Los Angeles has to be 24/7. The whole shift they're trying to relieve the challenge, the problem that the U.S. facing. The supermarket is in shortage of goods and things like that. Where China is is always doing well on those infrastructure. For example, out of the 10 largest port, 7 of them are in China. And also, as you mentioned, China is the leading technology, biggest producer of clean energy vehicle on wind power and solar power and hydropower. Yet, so can we actually work together? The U.S. has proposed this infrastructure bill, still hasn't been completely approved yet. And but there is a structure. Then President Biden said, build back better world, B3W. I mean, can the B3W, work with China, for example, Belt and Road? I mean, or can we elevate Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to a global infrastructure investment bank? So that really we're trying to build up some larger pie for China and the US to work together, rather than we demonize each other or we view each other as a threat. So those are really how we can work together. I mean, multilateralism, World Bank, ADB, AFDB, and the IMF, WTO. Can we really work together? What do you think about that? Can we find a larger pie, that a better objective for both countries and the world to work together, rather than we've been obsessed with this geopolitical conflict?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a very noble objective, Henry. And I think it can be done, but to achieve that, to achieve global cooperation, you first need to explain to people why global cooperation is important. And, I wrote a book on global governance called The Great Convergence, which actually has been published in China also. And in that book, I explain that the globalization has shrunk the world. And as a result of shrinking the world has changed fundamentally. And to explain how it has changed fundamentally, I have used the analogy of what I call a boat analogy. So in the past, when 7.8 billion people live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats. And each boat had a captain or crew to take care of it. And the boats were separate. So if one boat got COVID-19, then another boat would not get COVID-19 because they're on a different boat, right? COVID-19 cannot go from one boat to another boat, right? But the world has shrunk. And now the 7.8 billion people, when they live in 193 separate countries, they're no longer living in 193 separate boats. They're living in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And if you had any doubts about it, COVID-19 showed it. COVID-19 began in one cabin, maybe it began in China, and it spread around the world, right? Clearly. So it shows that we are all of us on the same boat. So if you're on the same boat, we should take care of our common boat. And we now know, frankly, that if we destroy planet Earth, we have no alternative, right? If we destroy the environment, the climate, the atmosphere of planet Earth, and we have we cannot go and live in any other planet. We cannot transport 7.8 billion people to Mars or anywhere. And Mars is not inhabitable anyway, you know, maybe except for Elon Musk, maybe he can go and build a small colony for himself there. But you know, humanity cannot go and live in those places. So it's important for us to understand that we are now on the same boat and that we have a common destiny and we have common challenges. But this requires a complete change in mindset on the part of the policymakers. But the problem here is that especially many of the Western policymakers, their concepts of geopolitics come from the 19th century. And you know, when I talk about the structural forces that explain why the US-China geopolitical contest is continuing, is because they're applying 19th century geopolitical concepts to the 21st century. Because in the past, when you live in separate countries, it's as though you're living in separate boats. Now all of us live on the same boat. So our common interests and common challenges are much more important. And therefore, I hope that we got to change them. If you want to achieve what you suggested in your question, Henry, how we can all cooperate together, we can, but we must first of all understand why we need to cooperate. And the reason why we need to cooperate is we are on the same boat. And that's the fundamental reason.
Yeah, absolutely. You're I think, excellent metaphor. You know, we are living in the same village. We are on the same boat. We are on the same planet. Exactly. You know, we're fighting the virus. We don't know where it is coming from alien probably. We have to really put our acts together. One of the things I noticed, Kishore, is that of course when we say we have to work together, collaborate, people always say, oh, you have a different values, you have a different system, you have a different development model, which does not converge with us, as you said in the book. You know, they were not convergent after so many years. And then they felt, okay, it's not us, it's you and me and you and us, and we're different. So, but somehow it's not that right. I mean, you as a person, you know, lived in Asia for so long and also knows West so well. You know, actually the Chinese history and Chinese culture is that Chinese always there is a Oriental value attached to that as well. I mean, of course, even you said the CPC could be a China civilization party because, you know, it has the Marxism, but also it has a lot of Chinese characteristic of Chinese culture and things like that. Now China actually said, President Xi just last week said, you know, that China has actually gone through the whole process democracy. So democracy doesn't mean you come at the voting time, but afterwards, how you can really serve the people, get feedbacks, and the consultative democracy, all the delegates to talk. But then you have a meritocracy. You mentioned in the book, they be picking the best people, deliver one 5-year plan after another 5-year plan. So that really helps. But also we are living in the 21st century now. I think people can use the old feudalist time, 100,000 years ago, the model to measure contemporary. For example, in China today, you have 1 billion smartphone users. It's a technology democracy. Where to go, where to buy, where to shop. They've been really, making the votes every day. And then you have, you also have a market democracy. Basically people have a freedom to go travel, choosing jobs. So you talk about democracy, but also we are living in a world of democracy. Probably the largest opposition party is the U.S. U.S. government for China. So people read all the digest everything, you get feedback, all the information, think tanks. So the leaders can make very wise decisions so that they can avoid kind of the old, the old days when the information was not really that easy. You need everybody to vote on that. So that kind of a new model. I mean with the Chinese characteristics. Would that explain some of Chinese success on KPI, the fastest growing economy? So that Fukuyama-san said it's not the end of the history. Can we accept this kind of a new Oriental or Chinese development methodology, and so that we don't really think you have to converge with us, otherwise I'm going to make you an evil empire for that. So can we come to a more multipolar or maybe more diversified world in terms of value, in terms of acceptance, in terms of respect each other for way to work? Yeah.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the I've written about before I wrote the book Has China Won, I wrote a book called Has the West Lost It? And I've written about an essay called The West and the Rest in a magazine called The National Interest in 1993, 28 years ago. And you see, one of the most arrogant assumptions that the West has had in looking at the world, and you mentioned Francis Fukuyama. As you know, Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay called The End of History at the End of the Cold War, in which he said, basically, it's a sophisticated message, but what all the Westerners heard was that the West has succeeded, the West has achieved liberal democracy, and all the rest of the world now has to copy the West, so the West doesn't have to adapt and change to other cultures or other civilizations. And as I say, in a somewhat cruel fashion, in my book, Has the West Lost It?, that Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West because it put the West to sleep precisely at the time when other Asian civilizations were waking up, including Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, Southeast Asian civilizations. So I think it's important for the West to accept the notion that other civilizations will not become carbon copies of the West. I mean, that's the most fundamental thing that the West has got to learn to accept. And the strange thing is that even though the West preaches liberalism, now liberalism means that you accept different points of view, alternative points of view. But ironically, the liberals in the West cannot accept a world of diverse civilizations and of civilizations that are not carbon copies of the West. And China is certainly not going to become a carbon copy of the West, because Chinese civilization is as old as Western civilization, maybe even older than Western civilization. So of course, China is going to be quite different. And in the case of China, Chinese leaders have to understand Chinese history, Chinese tradition, Chinese culture and also Chinese strengths and weaknesses. And in the case of China, whenever the central government in China is weak, the Chinese people suffer. So when the Chinese government is strong, central government is strong, the Chinese people benefit. And that's why the last 30 to 40 years of Chinese history have been the best 30 to 40 years of Chinese history for the bottom 50% in China in 4,000 years of Chinese history. Now that's a remarkable fact about China that many in the West are not aware of, you know. So it is in a sense, Chinese civilization is coming back again after having gone to sleep for almost 200 years. But Chinese civilization has failed to explain the nature of Chinese civilization to the Western audience. They don't understand it at all. Instead, if there's anything negative that they can pick up a story on China about, they'll write the negative stuff. So when recently, when China cracked down on big tech companies like Alibaba, like Tencent, and like Didi, you know, all the West said, okay, China is going after big companies and China is going to destroy itself. Really? I mean, okay, China may destroy itself. Or is China trying to create a society which is not a plutocracy? And as you know, in my book, Henry, I give a whole chapter to the question of why America is weakening itself by becoming a plutocracy. So if China decides not to become a plutocracy, that's a positive development for China. So, you know, this is something, again, that's very hard to explain to a Western audience. So what China needs to do a better job of is to explain to the West and say, we respect the fact that you in the West, you want to have a certain kind of society, which works better for America, for the West, where you emphasize individual rights more than individual responsibilities. But maybe China wants to have a society that emphasizes individual responsibilities more than individual rights. And okay, we have diverse world. We have two different kinds of social models. Let each society choose its own social model, and then we see which is the best. Instead of saying that the West is best and the rest must copy the West. That's what the West has been saying. And it may not necessarily be what is good for other societies. And this is what China needs to explain in a very careful and nuanced fashion. But so far, it has not succeeded in explaining to the West that actually China will never become a carbon copy of the West. That's all.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think you put it well. I mean, exactly. I think the individual, China put more individual responsibility, more to the individual right. You know, but it's a Chinese social model, and that's the model that actually China contained the COVID-19 because you had the quarantine, you had the lockdown, you had the people, you know, stay at home, but then maybe sacrifice about a bit of individual right. But then it really, the whole society got very free and very function so well. So this actually, this pandemic crisis has actually, on the one hand, proven that maybe you know, the Chinese way of doing things may not be necessarily as bad as people thought in the West. So it's you're right. We have to really talk to people more on that as well, so that we can really explain better how China works. I mean, for example, this year, you know, I mean, it was 100 years of you know, CPC actually founded. But then you see, China has already, President Xi announced that, of course, we have eliminated extreme poverty. You know, that for the 800 million people, that accounts 70% of the global poverty reduction, and fulfill the UN 2030 agenda, 10 years of a schedule. As Larry Summers actually told me at the CCG that this is probably something compatible to the Industrial Revolution of Great Britain, or even greater than that. But see, China never stopped. China now proposed another objective, is the common prosperity. China, after leaving 800 million people of extreme poverty, now they are thinking about the working class. Those DD drivers, those migrant workers, or those delivery boys, and all those working 250 million migrant workers working in different parts of China, where Premier Li has addressed, 600 million people living about 1,000 RMB a month. So now they're working on those less wealthy, less affluent. Exactly to avoid the problem you mentioned in your book about what happened in the U.S. is 1% of Wall Street, maybe equal to the 50% of the general population that really hasn't really seen any progress in the last several decades. So this common prosperity, now I think the government is having, as you mentioned about, there's also trying to stop some monopolizing of the big big conglomerate, big companies, but also trying to be more fair. Like recently, there's also clamp down on extreme extra activities on after school for those too much burden on the pre-pupil, on the elementary student or high school student. So I think there's a lot of way Chinese government, as I said, have a strong central government, and then they are pushing for those noble objectives, trying to achieve another goal for 2049, which by 2035, China is going to build a well-to-do society, but by 2049, a modernized society. So what do you think about this common prosperity? China now immediately shifted for another, building probably the largest middle class in the world now. I mean, with the common prosperity. What's your take on that?
Well, as you know, in the West, there are two schools of, outside China, there are two schools of thought on common prosperity and what China is trying to do with it. The Anglo-Saxon view is that that China is shooting itself in the foot with the common prosperity, because when China goes after the big tech companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Didi, and when China restricts the power and influence of big companies, then China is only ensuring that American big tech will succeed and win. So some people in the Anglo-Saxon world are actually celebrating the fact that China is going after all these big tech companies. That's one school of thought. But the other school of thought, and this is what I suppose is the view maybe in China, is that these companies in some ways have become too powerful and are putting the interests of the company ahead of the interests of society in many areas. And so, for example, like video games may be bad for the population at large, and too much tuition may be bad for the society at large. So what China is trying to do is some kind of a societal correction, which may actually help the Chinese people and help Chinese families, and maybe may result in once again China producing more babies if you create a more balanced society for people, especially at the bottom. And so right now there are these two schools of thought on what common prosperity means, and with only time will tell which school is right. But I think it's at the same time, it's very, very courageous for the Chinese government to take on some of these big tech companies, because you may end up in China hurting itself in the process. So it's got to be done very carefully, and it's got to be handled in such a way that, on the one hand, the common prosperity spreads in China, but on the other hand, you got to make sure that China's global economic growth also doesn't slow down. And so these are contradictory objectives that you got to handle very well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. We need to strike a balance for that. Yeah, you're right. I think that on the one hand, we need to really, to maintain the economic vitality and entrepreneurship and, market forces to be ever strong. But on the other hand, I think we also need to raise the working class in China, and then so that the migrant workers, for example, I mean, they had a well protected. I think China's made a lot of progress for that. For example, China now has over 1 billion people have some kind of a social security benefit already, and 1.3 billion people have some kind of Medicare protection already. So that's probably the largest in the world. And then just to really improve on that, to create a larger middle class, I think this is something, as you said, very bold initiative. But if it handles well, it really can avoid this polarizing society that we see in some other countries, and that maybe populism, nationalism could be really keep at the base, so that not going to really disrupt the whole society, that the progress China is making. So that's my understanding of this common prosperity. Yeah. Now I'd like to maybe shift to another area. I think that last year we actually see at the end of last year we see a very big breakthrough. Actually, just during this presidential changing from Trump to Biden, we see RCEP has been concluded during this time. We see China also signed a big agreement with CAI, with EU. On comprehensive investment treaty, but of course this year, China has been very strong. That after Premier President Xi, last year President Xi at the APEC summit mentioned about China is positively considering joining CPTPP, and this year Chinese Minister of Foreign Commerce has actually officially applied to join CPTPP. So, do you think about this Asian prosperity, this Asian, now, ASEAN has already become the largest trading partner of China. I mean, this region, we're seeing Asian rising, and then that's also it's another book you've been writing, an Asian in the 21st century, that we are also translating now, and will be published by CITIC again. But what do you think about this Asian rising, and also the importance, the implications, and also the East Asian, East Asian culture, and how is this going to impact with all those latest trade scheme happening?
Well, you're absolutely right, Henry, that it is actually quite surprising that in the past, the #1 champion of free trade agreements used to be the United States of America by far. And I remember in 1985, I accompanied the then Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when he addressed a joint session of the United States Congress in 1985. So this is 36 years ago. And in that speech, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew mentioned about how the United States, by championing free trade and by explaining the virtues of free trade, had helped to generate global prosperity in the world. 36 years ago, it was the United States that wanted to sign free trade agreements with everybody. And I think China had not signed a single free trade agreement in 1985. And what's amazing is that today, the roles have reversed in a very profound way, where today United States Congress is not willing to sign or ratify any free trade agreement. So you mentioned the CPTPP. I mean, it was actually President Obama who signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the US Congress and US Senate will not ratify it at all. And so it's a tragedy. And now it's actually China that wants to join the Comprehensive Partnership for Trade, CPTPP. So, it shows how much the world has changed. So it's very important that we in East Asia continue to promote free trade. And here I must say, on the question of free trade, I'm glad you mentioned that RCEP is being concluded. Actually, many Asian countries delayed the conclusion of the RCEP because they were very keen to get India to join the RCEP. And I must say, I felt very sad when at the last minute, India decided not to join the RCEP, because by not joining the RCEP, India is not participating in the great growth and success story of East Asia. But we in East Asia must continue to push for greater trade liberalization, because the theory of comparative advantage that Ricardo set out is still valid and alive today. And even though even if a country like United States or India and others have walked away from the virtues of free trade, we in East Asia must continue to push for it, because trade not only generates economic prosperity, trade also generates peace. And one of the things I have launched recently, Henry, you can Google and find it, is the Asian Peace Program, APP, Asian Peace Program. And if you go to our website, what we're trying to do is to generate peace in East Asia. And we believe that one good way of generating peace in East Asia is through encouraging greater trade and encouraging greater free trade agreements too. And in fact, I myself have written about that in several different places. So I hope that we in East Asia would not just support the RCEP, but should also welcome China's application to join the CPTPP.
Yes, thank you. I think that's really a great news. I think China is very active now to pursue that. But also talk about Asia. I mean, you are the expert on Asia, and also been studying and research this fast growing continent for a long time. But there's also geopolitical risk there, as there's particularly there's big rivalry. Now we have the issue of South China Sea, we have the issue of Taiwan, but I see, those has been always, ASEAN has been caught in the middle between U.S. and China, rivalry in the region probably, and Japan, for example, is also quite, allied with U.S. But I'm glad to see recently President Xi actually spoke to, Prime Minister of Singapore, but also new Prime Minister of Japan. And so, what do you see the solution of this, South China Sea issue with ASEAN countries, and it's probably this Taiwan issue, and also ASEAN country taking sides? I mean, if they have to, if there's really a serious geopolitical conflict, what's your advice to the region, for example?
Well, by the way, you're right. There are many difficult issues in our region. And in fact, the reason why I launched working with my colleagues in the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore, the reason why we launched the Asian Peace Program is that there are many geopolitical flashpoints in East Asia, including South China Sea and Taiwan. And there are many such issues that are a problem. But what we have to do is to send a message that even though we continue to have differences over many of these issues like South China Sea, we do not go to war over them. We try to negotiate peacefully and arrive at understanding. So for example, the ASEAN countries and China are trying to reach agreement on the code of conduct. So this is something that we should push harder and harder to get an agreement on, to ensure that there's no conflict in the South China Sea. And I think we can avoid war in the South China Sea. But I'm not so optimistic that we can avoid war on Taiwan, because on the issue of Taiwan, Taiwan is a much more sensitive issue for China because, you know, China believes that Taiwan has always been a part of China and should at one point in time reunify with China. And of course, all of us are hoping for a peaceful reunification between Taiwan and China. But for that to happen, it's important that all the parties do not violate the one China policy that has been agreed to by everybody. And this is what worried me about the Trump administration, because in the Trump administration, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, tried to walk away from the one China policy. And that's very, very dangerous, because once you walk away from the one China policy, you may trigger a war across the Taiwan Straits. And a war across the Taiwan Straits, if the United States gets involved, may lead to a nuclear war, and millions of people will die in a nuclear war. So it's important for people to understand that the stakes on Taiwan are very high, and that it could lead to a very dangerous outcome of a nuclear war. And so the best way to avoid a nuclear war is not to change the status quo on Taiwan. And then do not change the status quo, we must all respect the one China policy. And this is something, for example, most Asian countries respect the one China policy. And so we must all speak out and explain to the Western countries why the one China policy is important and why they should not go back on agreements that were negotiated very carefully between the United States and China over the past 50 years since Henry Kissinger went to China in July 1971.
Yeah, thank you. I think absolutely a very important cornerstone. I think the three communique between US and China, you know, we really should maintain that momentum and not changing status quo for that. And in order to really not avoid this military conflict, that's really important. So you know, finally, before I go to the media question, I have another one. Is that now, you know, this year is the China joining the UN for 50th anniversary. Is China joining the APEC for 30th anniversary? China joined WTO for 20th anniversary. And it's really, you know, it's symbolized China's open for the rest of the world. So, I mean, you know, in your book, you mentioned also that, you know, when Bretton Woods was founded, I mean, or you talked in the past, that there was only 2.5 billion, how many billion people in the world? And today it's 7.8 billion people, you just mentioned. So does the world global governance is falling behind global practice? Can we really reflect that? I mean, what can be done for the world and then multilateralism, and how China can really play some you know, more responsible role and larger role into this process? Because you know, we need to upgrade the current global system, you know, enhance it and improve it. So what's your advice to the global? You've been worked at the UN for so long. I mean, you know, China is celebrating actually. China joined the UN for the 50th anniversary. So what do you think about multilateralism, where China should do more, or maybe the world should we can collaborate better with the world?
Thank you. Very, very good question. And you know, as you mentioned, Henry, I was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years. And after having been ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I fell in love with the United Nations. And I think the United Nations is one of the most wonderful organizations in the world. And the United Nations Charter is one of the most beautiful documents in the world. So we should work together to try to strengthen the United Nations. And one of the mistakes that the West has been making, and I documented this in my book, the Global Convergence, which, as I said, has the Great Convergence, sorry, which has been published in China also. is that the West, even though the West created all these multilateral institutions, including the United Nations and including affiliated organizations like World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, the West has been trying to weaken these organizations over the past 30, 40 years. And I keep emphasizing that this is against Western interests when they do so, because it's not in their interest. The West represents a minority in the global village, and it's not wise for the West to strengthen institutions of global governance in a global village. And so I hope that China will do the exact opposite of what the West is doing when it comes to the United Nations. And for a start, I think that China should try to revive the United Nations General Assembly. Because the United Nations General Assembly, at the end of the day, represents what I would call the Parliament of Man, or the National People's Congress of humanity. And so China should do its best to go to the United Nations General Assembly and debate many of these global issues. So when the United States invaded Iraq, they said, oh, we are doing something which is in accordance with international law. Well, all you had to do is to have a debate in the UN General Assembly and let all the countries speak out. And most of the countries would say, this is not in accordance with international law. In fact, as Kofi Annan said, since the United States invasion of Iraq was neither an act of self-defense nor endorsed by the UN Security Council, it was illegal under international law. But that's something the UN General Assembly can say. So I hope that China will do its very best to try and revive, strengthen, and support the United Nations, because the United Nations may become, at the end of the day, a valuable kind of a soft line of defense for China, because anytime the West attacks China, the China can take the issue to the UN General Assembly and then ask the rest of the world, do you agree with the West or do you agree with China? Right? Have a debate. And then the West will be surprised to discover that many in the world don't agree with many of the points that the West is making on global governance issues. And so this provides a geopolitical opportunity for China to strengthen these institutions of global governance like the United Nations.
Yeah. Thank you for that sound advice. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, China should attach more importance to the UN, which I think they are already doing now. China has already become the second largest donor to the United Nations, and also the largest peacekeeping force standing country among the P5 member countries. And absolutely, I think there's more. Probably in the future, we're now facing climate change. We are facing digital economy. Maybe we should have international data organization, or maybe a carbon international climate change. So that multilateralism, we need some new structure, and that hope that China can be more actively involved on that. You're right. We should really get us more actively involved. I mean, this is half a century has passed since China embraced again UN system, which I think still the cornerstone of the world peace and prosperity, and China should really, as you said, be more active there and have a debate. I mean, on the global parliament there. I mean, that's really the right word to put it. So we have actually had a very fascinating discussion, and we have before we know you come, we have collected a few questions on this. We actually, my staff was telling me we had almost 250,000 people watch us online, which is very significant. So I have a question from China News Agency that mentioned, basically, he said, you once said that the US Biden administration's China strategy is doomed to fail. And why is the evaluation? What do you think is the biggest problem, the current US strategy towards China? So the news, China News Agency actually been following you and raise this question for you.
Well, I think, the tragedy about the Biden administration's policy towards China is that on the one hand, Joe Biden is a much nicer man than Donald Trump. We should all be happy. We should all clap that Joe Biden won the elections and Donald Trump did not win the elections, because he's a much nicer guy and a much more friendly and a more thoughtful person. And I was actually hoping that the Biden administration would therefore adopt a fresh approach towards China. But unfortunately, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my comments, I've been in the United States for a week now, and the mood in the United States is very, very anti-China. And many in Americans see China as the enemy. And therefore, the Biden administration's hands are tied and they cannot change the policy. And the tragedy, the reason why it's a real tragedy that they cannot change the policy, and you mentioned about the strategy, as I document in my book, Has China Won?, which you have just published and translated into Chinese, the fundamental mistake the United States has made is that it has launched a geopolitical contest against China without working out a strategy. That's amazing. There's no strategy. And as you know, I say in the book that the man who gave me this insight that United States doesn't have a strategy is actually America's greatest living strategic thinker, Henry Kissinger. And as you know, he was the man responsible for opening up US-China relations in July 1971, 50 years ago. And he was the one who said to me that America doesn't have a strategy. And also, evidence shows that the Biden administration doesn't have a strategy, because all the Biden administration has to do is ask a very simple question. What are your goals? Are you trying to isolate China, like America successfully isolated the Soviet Union with a containment policy? It's not possible. China does more trade with the world than the United States does. You cannot contain the world's largest trading power. Are you trying to overthrow the Communist Party of China? It's not possible, because the Communist Party of China, as a Harvard Kennedy School has documented, a study has documented, is very popular. It's not, you cannot overthrow it. Enjoys the support of the people. Are you going to stop China from becoming the #1 economy in the world? It's impossible. You cannot stop it, because just as China continues to grow and do well and has the same per capita income as other East Asian countries, China, with 4 times the population of the United States, will have a larger economy than United States. So so all these possible goals are not attainable. So the first question the Biden administration should answer is, what are the strategic objectives of the United States in launching this contest against China? And I, as someone, I watch this issue so closely, but there are no answers at all. No answers. No answers as to what the strategy of the Biden administration is. So I actually, as a friend of the United States, am trying to tell the United States that you are knocking your head against a wall, and you must step back and maybe think very hard before you carry out any actions against China, because you cannot, a young republic like the United States, which is less than 250 years old, with 1/4 the population of China, cannot transform a 4,000-year-old Chinese civilization with 4 times the population of the United States. That's a mission impossible. So why not accept the reality and accept the fact that you cannot transform China, and therefore learn to live in a world where there are diverse civilizations and diverse societies. Yep. That's the way to approach it.
Yeah, that's a great message. I think that absolutely, we're not trying to change each other. It's a faceted world. Maybe we should try to be more colorful and accept each other for the better, prosperity of the world. And I think you made a very good point there. And also the China News Agency News Service has another question, is that in recent years, of course, U.S. is trying to strengthen the ties with Japan and South Korea, and of course ASEAN is now the largest trading partner. So there's a problem of East Asia and North Asia. How this can China was this actually confuses value and society, which is more at East North Asia. Now China is caught in between. So the U.S. is trying to at least now get allied Japan and trying to get South Korea into that. So how does East Asian ASEAN country cope with that? I mean, there's a division of Asian also. So can we really get some Asian prosperity and Asian values or Confucius values that we can really have wisdom that we can learn from or benefit from?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, Henry, I think you're aware that I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. You mentioned this in the introduction, and it was published by Beijing University Press. And the ASEAN countries are truly a miracle because they have taken the most diverse region of planet Earth, Southeast Asia, with a population of 650 million people. And the 650 million people include 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Hindus, Taoists, Confucianists. And so Southeast Asia is the most diverse region of planet Earth. And even though it's the most diverse region of planet Earth, it's been peaceful now for since its founding in 1967 for 54 years. So it's very, very important for the world to understand that ASEAN is a remarkable organization. And in fact, ASEAN should be regarded as the litmus test of what can be doable or not doable in this world today. So when the United States is trying to isolate China, the ASEAN countries are saying, all of them are saying, they're very different countries, but they're all saying we want to be friends with the United States, but we also want to be friends with China. And we don't ask us to choose between United States and China. And when all the 10 ASEAN countries say this in a united fashion, that sends a very powerful message to the United States that you should be careful about trying to isolate China. Now, of course, the trouble about Northeast Asia is that even though Northeast Asia, the countries of South Korea, Japan, China, Mongolia, and others, most of them are more prosperous and successful than Southeast Asian countries. There still isn't an association of Northeast Asian nations to match the association of Southeast Asian nations. So I think this is something that Japan and South Korea should ask themselves this question. Why isn't there a similar successful regional organization in the Northeast to match the regional organization in the Southeast in ASEAN? So I think it's very important for both Japan and South Korea to try and learn lessons from ASEAN on how to manage global affairs. Because Japan, as you know, has always been trying to copy Europe. But Europe, Europe represents the past. America represents the present. Asia represents the future. So Japan should learn more from Southeast Asia now and stop trying to be the most European country in East Asia. And that way, I think we'll have a much more peaceful and harmonious region in our part of the world if everyone tries to learn from ASEAN.
Great. I think that's the best way to put it. Asian is the future. Absolutely. I think we, as Asian country now, is already the most vibrant and most fastest growing economy in the world. ASEAN has actually set a good example, as you said in your book. But at half a century of ASEAN, I mean, that's amazing. That has produced such a great, diversified, but also unified international way of get together and get organized. So I think we all have an inspiration from that. ASEAN is already become a much stronger unity, and now it's the largest trading partner with China. We actually should, collaborate more, and the same with East Asian. And we hope that, China, Japan, Korea free trade agreement can be really also concluded as soon as possible. Now the final question, we have another one from Hongxin News, basically saying you've been 10 years at the UN, and you know that organization so well. So what do you think about anything to improve on the UN as a whole, or anything that that UN could do better? I mean, in cope with now the new dilemma and the new challenge we're facing today. I mean, in terms of COVID-19 and climate change and other things. So anything that you can have some advice for the UN as well, being an ex-UN ambassador.
Well, yeah, I mean, I as you know, I said earlier, I love the United Nations, and I still I believe the United Nations represents the future, because at the end of the day, to use, earlier on, I used the boat metaphor, right, to show how 193 countries are now 193 cabins on the same boat, right? And why don't I change the metaphor and use the metaphor that Kofi Annan used? And Kofi Annan said that, the former Secretary General of the UN, the world has become a global village. And as you know, if you live in a village, you must have a council to decide where to build the roads and how to collect the taxes and how to take care of a fire in the village, all these are common problems, right? What they call the global commons problems. Now, who's going to do all that? And the answer is the United Nations, right? And the tragedy is that, as I said earlier, which I document in my book, The Great Convergence, the West, even though they created the United Nations, have been weakening the United Nations. So what we in Asia need to do is to strengthen the United Nations. Henry, you mentioned that China has already become the second largest contributor to the UN system. That's very good. In fact, China should become the largest contributor to the UN system, just to send a signal that the amount of money involved to support the UN is just peanuts. Really, it costs less. The budget of the United Nations regular budget is less than the budget of the New York City Fire Department. I mean, this is the New York City Fire Department takes care of only 10 million people in New York. The UN takes care of 7.8 billion people around the world. So why is the budget of the UN smaller than the New York City Fire Department? So clearly we must do something more to save the world, right? And this is why it's very important for especially those of us in Asia to understand that the West is making a huge strategic mistake in weakening the UN, and we must fight back against that. And one way of fighting back is to give more resources to the UN. And I'm glad that China today contributes more peacekeeping forces than the rest of the P5 combined. And that's something that we should also continue to do more of. So we in Asia should say that the UN is important, that the World Health Organization is important, the World Trade Organization, the UNESCO is important. Go through all these organizations and say we want to support all these organizations, and therefore stop all the Western efforts to weaken that. And if we can get a great consensus in Asia to support the UN, then frankly, the world will be a much better place, because a world in which you have a stronger global village council is a safer and more peaceful world.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kishore. I think that is very sound advice. I mean, exactly. now Asians should support UN more. And also a lot of world problem is now, for example, the recently G20 and passed the new proposal that the minimum global corporate tax, which 15% applied, so that we really should avoid some companies making huge money outside their country but not benefiting its Midwest or its local workers. So then China take all the blame. So I think the global governance should really be strengthened in terms of have a better distribution of the wealth and also have a better argument debate at the UN. So I think your advice is very good, and China actually can play more active role in this global system and support UN with other Asian countries. So I think we are quite. I know it's quite late now in New York, and thank you so much for taking so much time to talk to me. And so we are very pleased that your book has China won. Now the Chinese version has been officially published, translated by CCG and published by one of the most famous publishers in China, the CITIC Press, which has published Kissinger's On China, has published recently Schwartzman's book, and many Warren Buffett, and many books, and so I'm glad. I'm sure you're going to be a bestseller in China. But again, I really value our friendship, our exchanges, and we hope that we can receive you again. But I think today we had a very good discussion. We talked about so many issues. Talk about China-U.S. relations, which is I think one of the main theme of your book. Talking about the climate change, international global governance, United Nations, ASEAN, Asia, all the UN system. So a host of subject we're going to summarize that. We're going to redistribute as well. I mean, we already had about 250,000 people watching this our dialogue. So once again, I want to thank you very much, and hope to see you at next time when you're in China at CCG. So
let me also quickly just thank you very much for inviting me to this dialogue. I'm actually quite shocked to learn that there are 250,000 people watching this dialogue that you and I have just done. I hope this means that we have sold 250,000 copies of the book or so to all the people who are watching, and I think they'll find it a useful book to understand US-China relations. But I share your hope that we'll have this dialogue once again, and I hope next time we will do it in person together, in face-to-face rather than virtually. So let's hope for that day will come very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kishu. We'll leave to rest now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.